Answers to your MBTI questions webinar. My name is Kim Rivera, and I'm the Associate Marketing Manager here at CPP. I'll be moderating today's webinar, which will run approximately for 1 hour. During the presentation, if you have questions, please submit them to me using the question function in the webinar controls. Patrick will be saving the latter part of the webinar to answer your questions. Linda Hafer, a representative from CPP's education team, is also in attendance. She will be available to answer questions as well. As with all of our Ask an Expert webinars, today's webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sending out a link to the recording in the next few days. Please note that the PowerPoint slides are not available for our Ask an Expert series. Now, I'm very happy to welcome CPP's Ask an Expert, Patrick Kerwin. Patrick is the owner of Kerwin & Associates in San Diego, California, and is an MBTI master practitioner. For over 20 years, he has used the MBTI instrument to develop individuals, teams, and organizations. He conducts MBTI workshops on a variety of topics, including stress, team building, career development, leadership, change, and conflict. Patrick also conducts the MBTI certification program and is the author of True Type Tales, a collection of stories about the power of personality type in everyday life. So please join me in welcoming Patrick as I turn over the webinar to him. Welcome, Patrick.
Great. Thank you, Kim, very much, and welcome to all of you to today's webinar. So no matter how long you've used the MBTI assessment, your students or your clients are going to come up with questions that sometimes can stump you or you're not sure the answer to. And sometimes when you're using the assessment, you have your own questions that come up or things that you wonder about. So today what we thought we'd do is a little something different and answer the questions that you have about the assessments. So we really only have a couple of goals today. Usually we've got a long list of goals, but we've only got a couple. And so our first objective is to make sure you can get the answers to the questions that you submitted regarding the Step 1 and Step 2 assessments ahead of time. And then also to receive answers to the questions that you and others can ask in real time today. So in terms of our timing, I'm going to spend about 40 to 45 minutes going over answers to the questions that were submitted in advance. And then I'll spend about 10 or 15 minutes going over the answers that you submit in real time. So let's get to the questions. And there were lots of questions submitted about clarity on the MBTI assessments. And some of those questions were, how do you interpret assessments that show balanced results? What do high scores versus low scores mean? What's the best way to interpret low scores? What do you say if a person says, I'm exactly in the middle of a scale? And could you explain the clarity of a person's preference? All right, so to answer these questions, we just need to get familiar or refamiliar with some of the language on clarity. And we're going to talk about the Preference Clarity Index, known as the PCI, and the Preference Clarity Category, known as the PCC. And if you are using a computer-scored version of the MBTI assessment, you will see something that looks like this on the report, and that shows the clarity of preferences. So what we have here is we've got these words across the top here, slight, moderate, clear, very clear, going in both directions. That happens to be the preference clarity category. So the PCC is just simply the word. And then you've got these PCI results at the bottom. So 26 for extroversion, 26 for intuition. These lines obviously correspond to those numbers, and that's considered to be the PCI. We'll talk about what those mean in just a minute. If you are using the self-scorable version of the MBTI assessment, you will get the preference clarity category, the PCC, on the report. And so when the person comes to the part of tabulating his or her results, they'll enter the number of preference points that they had for E and for I, and so forth, come up with their 4-letter type. And then down here, what you'll see is the preference clarity category. So the highest number up here is circled down here, and then it corresponds to a category of slight, moderate, clear, very clear. And then down here, those words are just entered to show the clarity of the person's reported preference. So to answer the question about how do you respond to questions about clarity, we need to remind ourselves of a few elements about what the Myers-Briggs is and what the Myers-Briggs isn't. And the first thing is that the Myers-Briggs assessment is a sorting tool. So Jung's theory is a dichotomous model, so it's a one or the other kind of model, and so the assessment is an either-or kind of model. So the assessment we're really doing is we've got two buckets for each dichotomy, right? And we're just saying, do you have a preference for E or do you have a preference for I? And we do that for each dichotomy. We're not saying how full is your bucket. We're not asking you, when do you use the one bucket or the other bucket. We're just saying, which one is your preference? Do you have a preference for this one or do you have a preference for that one? All right, now the Myers-Briggs assessment is not a measuring tool. And so we don't have any scale that we're measuring people on. So we're not going to use a measuring stick. We're not going to use a ruler. We don't have any sort of scale that we're using for the Myers-Briggs. And we're not asking the question, how much do you have? So one of the hardest things about the Myers-Briggs, but one of the first things to do, is to try to lose some of the language. It's really easy to use, and that is to try to lose words like high score, low score, being in the middle, being balanced, having a scale, having a strong preference. You'll hear people say, gee, you're an off-the-chart E. And I am always telling people there is no chart to be on or off of. And people will often say, I'm on the fence. And I'll say, there actually is no fence. There are two buckets. And this is the most confusing part of the Myers-Briggs, both for people who are receiving Myers-Briggs reports and also people who are interpreting those reports. And it's no big surprise, really, because we have all been exposed to many tests that measure. So if you look at actual tests that use a measuring kind of system, we've been exposed to these from the get-go, right? So very early on in life, when you took any sort of test in school, you got your results back, and you were always asking, what was my score? Was I high? Was I low? How did I do? You can look at IQ, where they've got percentage of the population and the IQ score. And again, where do I fall? High, low, in the middle? If you work in an organization, a lot of organizations, when they do performance appraisal, they look at putting people's performance on a normal curve so that you have a few high performers here, a few low performers, and most people are in the middle. And that's just a little sample. There are many, many more. So if you think about getting into college, you had your SAT, you have your ACTs, graduate school, GRE, LSATs, MCATs, GMAT. All of those are tests that measure, and people are always asking, how did I do? How did I do? High, low, high, low. And even some things that people are exposed to on somewhat regular basis, like blood tests. You get your blood test results back. Here's the normal range, and it's one thing if you're high, it's one thing if you're low. So there's just lots of examples of these from way back for all of us and right up until present day. So it's a really natural place for people to go, ourselves included. Now, if we think about test sort, an actual test, when I do the certification program, we'll talk about this and we'll ask about what tests actually sort. And we actually kind of have a hard time coming up with some. Like sometimes blood test comes up, right? So you get sorted into one type or the other. Sometimes people say, well, there'll be a pass-fail exam, so that's kind of sorting you into one or the other. Some people say pregnancy test, either you are or you aren't. So there are others, but there just aren't as many that jump out to us that really say you are one or the other. So, this is kind of like why we use the left-hand, right-hand analogy with the Myers-Briggs. It's really kind of the closest that we have to illustrate this idea of sorting versus measuring. So now to get back to this preference clarity here, I'm going to use the PCI. You might be looking at this and you might be saying, all right, well, he just said that the Myers-Briggs isn't measuring, and I'm pretty sure what's on there looks like measurement. So is there another webinar I can attend with someone who understands PCI? I don't blame you if you think that, but there is measurement going on here. But what is being measured is the clarity. Okay? So in terms of your preferences, according to Jung's theory, you have preferences inside of you, and they don't have magnitude. They're not big. They're not small. They are just there. What we are really looking at with a PCI is we're looking at how clearly did your preference appear on the assessment. It's really telling us what's the likelihood that what's been reported is actually your preference. And in fact, what happens kind of behind the scenes is the computer goes through each of your items. For example, on the EI items, it goes through every single one of your EI items, and each one of those is weighted a little differently. And what it does when it looks at your results is it creates this maximum likelihood curve, which says this is where the maximum likelihood is of your preference. And so this says, you know what, there's a very clear likelihood that you have a preference for E. I work with a lot of physicians in my work, and so I'll often talk about, this is talking about how conclusive is the outcome. So this is very clearly conclusive. We can't say 100%, but we could say, you know, this is pretty conclusive. When someone reports their preference in the slight category, what it means is the likelihood that this person actually has a preference for F is slight based on the report, and it also tells us that we have slight conclusiveness. So it just means with a person like this, we're going to say, we're not quite sure if you have a preference for F because your preference, whatever it is, did not make it out on the assessment clearly. What we don't want to do, and this again is so easy to do with PCI information, is we don't want to say that this person is, you know, an off-the-chart E, which would be looking at a measuring, which would say they're way over here, which would imply an absence of introversion. This person can actually say, you know what, I'm actually very comfortable sitting in silence. I'm very comfortable listening, not talking. I maybe were trained as a counselor. It just happens that this person, you know, is really, we're pretty sure that person has a preference for extroversion. We also don't want to look at this kind of result here and tell the person, well, it's because you're a slight F. Because what slight F ends up implying is that somehow the person's feeling is little or diminished in some way. We also don't want to look at this as interpreting that, gee, you must be able to use T and F really comfortably. We don't know anything about frequency of use, ease of use, comfort of use from a PCI result. All we know is how much confidence or conclusiveness we have that what is reported is actually the person's preference. So, you know, back to the question on how do you interpret clarity information is you ask a lot of questions because the person is the one that needs to give us the answers. So I'm always asking people when they have a preference for F reported with slight clarity, I'll say, well, let's talk about your family. What was encouraged? Was T encouraged? Was F encouraged? What pulled you in a couple different directions here? What about your culture? Same kind of questions. Was a certain preference or certain preferences kind of held up as the norm or the standard for your culture? Society, did societal messages tell you that, you know, one way's better, one way's worse? And what about your work environment, or if you're a student, your school environment? Are there better ways to be as a student or better ways to be as a worker? So what we're just trying to do is ask people, you know, what were the expectations in your life? Why do you think you got pulled toward your opposite preference when you responded? And we let people give us the answers to those questions. Now, some of you may be thinking, but can't the PCI be explained by the Step 2 report? Well, not always, and I'll talk about the Step 2 report and why not always in a few minutes. All right, let's talk about a common conundrum that comes up for people. And this is a question that came up. What do you say to someone who says, I'm both? So again, I want to make sure that people really understand the Myers-Briggs instrument and that they're not looking at it as a measuring tool where it's better to be in the middle or something where you've got both. I want to make sure we're talking about just having a preference for one and making sure that that person doesn't think that having a preference for thinking means an absence of feeling or vice versa. The other thing I want to find out is does the person somehow think they have to be good at everything? You know, sort of like you need a blue ribbon for E, you need a blue ribbon for I, and a blue ribbon, and to let them know that we can't tell how good they are at any of these preferences from the report. We're just trying to tease out their preferences. It's kind of like we're trying to figure out if you're right-handed or left-handed. We don't know how good your handwriting is. Okay? We're just trying to figure out what your preference is. The other thing I want to make sure people understand is that it's not this great thing from a type perspective to, quote, be both. Because what Jung would say is trying to approach the task, a task, using two opposite preferences can cause interference. So if you're trying to do one thing and you don't have a clear way of doing it, those two preferences can interfere with each other, which is very different than saying, you know, I have a preference for tea. As I'm making the decision, I'm going to have to think about the impact on people. I'm going to bring in that part of myself. That's not saying you're both. It's not saying they're equal. It's saying you have a preference for one, and you're reminding yourself to bring in your opposite so that you can be most effective. Now, sort of a common conundrum in a related way is people might say, you know, oh, ENFP, ENFJ, doesn't matter. I'm both J and P. And what I want to say is, and what I do say is, actually it's more than J and P, because all of these letters, as you know, are all working together to form this dynamic personality. And so starting in a really simple way, what I could have them do is explore two-letter combinations. And in the back of your Introduction to Myers-Briggs type booklet, there are pages that give descriptions of two-letter combinations. For example, for a person like this, we could look at the EP descriptions, the first and last letter, versus the EJ description in the back of that book. And I'll have people read those descriptions and just say, which one sounds more like you, one or the other? We could also look at another two-letter combination, which is looking at the last two letters, FP and FJ, and seeing if that produces any internal clarity for the person. Sometimes that doesn't. And so you can kind of take it up a notch and explore the dominant function. And you can use the Introduction to Type Dynamics and Development booklet. I'm not promoting products here, by the way. These are booklets that I carry with me to every workshop because I use them in this case all the time. And the Type Dynamics and Development booklet I like for some pages in the back that describe each of the preferences in each of its attitudes. So in other words, it describes extroverted sensing and introverted sensing. And that describes extroverted intuition and introverted intuition. And for each of those, it gives 5 activities that are related to that particular function. So for an ENFP, the dominant is extroverted intuition. And for an ENFJ, it's extroverted feeling. And those two could not be more different. You know, when people say, oh, it's JP on both, it doesn't matter. Extroverted intuition is a perception function, which is taking in information. It's taking in new ideas. It's coming up with new ideas. It's making things bigger. It's keeping things open. And extroverted feeling is a judgment function, and so it's a decision-making function. So extroverted feeling is actually focused on closure. Extroverted feeling types want happy closure, but they want closure. So they actually couldn't be more different from one another. So sometimes that'll help. And if it doesn't, you can kind of go the other direction and explore the inferior function using that same booklet. And so for ENFPs, the inferior function is introverted sensing. And ENFPs will refer to that as those pesky details. It's storing, cataloging, remembering lots of facts and specifics, dealing with lots of facts and specifics. And for ENFJs, it's introverted thinking, which is making decisions internally, purely logically, not letting any sort of interpersonal influence leak in, which ENFJs will often say is a challenge for them. So sometimes I can have the person read either of those and see if one sounds more difficult for them than the other. And you can even take it a step farther if that didn't work, and you could look at type under stress, because the stress reactions for these two types are quite different as well. So when someone says I'm both, you know, I want to demonstrate how actually being one or the other is actually very different. So being an ENFP is very different from an ENFJ. All right, our next question. There are a lot of questions about this one too. How do you really help someone identify his or her true type preferences? And the questions here were, how do you keep the integrity of the program and the group when you have individuals that are clearly a different type preference than they purport? What do you do in type activities when someone is clearly in the wrong group that says that's the right preference for them? And what other strategies can be used to assist folks to be open to their type and not just to a type preference that appears more appealing to them? And so what we're talking about is you're doing an EI activity and there's someone in the I group who appears to have a preference for extroversion but swears that's the right group for them. Little like this little fella here who says, really, I'm a rabbit. So, it actually was quite a challenge to find a picture to really illustrate this concept, but I kind of love this little dog, so there you go. Okay, to answer that question, I thought I'd give you a few examples. And one of them is one I'm going to call, but I thought I was an ESTJ. And this came from a certification program I did a few months ago. And there was someone in that group who reported a preference for ESTJ, but the sensing preference was reported with slight clarity. And so she wasn't quite sure about that. So I told her, I said, well, we're going to do a sensing intuition activity. So when you do that, if you think you have a preference for sensing, join that group and we'll see what happens. And so I listened as people were doing the activity. I got them into their groups and then showed them a picture and then discussed the picture. And I listened to her contributions, and very quickly she started to say things like, well, I think it's a commentary on Sir Isaac Newton's theory of relativity because these are all objects that fly, and I'm watching the other people in the group who are confirmed sensing types, and I'm kind of seeing this kind of confused look on their face. But, we have 4 days together, so they're being very nice to her, but I thought, and so I stepped in, I said, how are you all doing? And I said, we don't know what she's talking about. And so I actually just pulled her out of the group, and I just said, why don't we let them have a conversation, because actually they're really settled on their preference, and why don't you visit the N group? And I said, the reason, and she kept saying, but I thought I was an ESTJ. And I said, well, you might be, but somehow the responses that you're giving in this activity seem to be seem like intuition responses. So why don't you go visit the N group? And she visited the N group, and then she just got completely confused and wasn't sure what her type was. On the third day, she finally got clear on her type, and what she realized was that she had been working in very sensing roles for most of her career, for which she was very good at. And then the other is that at home, she had taken on all of the sensing activities in kind of managing the household. This was quite interesting because also her husband was in the certification program. He had a preference for intuition, so I'm sure there was no shortage of conversations about that after that particular day of the program. But she realized that she had been doing a lot of sensing things. And this is one of the ways that we can really help people clarify is sometimes people get confused with what they do with what their preference is. And sometimes people do things that are in alignment with their preferences. Many times people regularly do activities that are outside of their preferences, and the doing and the preferring can get confusing for people. So those are the kind of things I worked on with her, and that seemed to help her land. The other one is, well, I'm sure I have a preference for N. And this was also a certification program that I did for a big high-tech firm that is really known for being sort of uber innovative and creative, and it's not Uber, by the way, but they're just like super hyper creative, and this was a certification program. There were about 12 people in this program. It was an HR OD department. Everyone in the group confirmed a preference for intuition, except for one person who wasn't sure about sensing or intuition, but she was owning N. She kept saying, well, I think I'm really an N. So I said, well, we've got the luxury of 4 days together, so we'll see. So on the next day, I started the workshop by asking people if they had any observations about type overnight. Sometimes people have observations at home or when they're out for dinner, whatever it is. And then, or do people have any questions about the Myers-Briggs assessment? So people will talk about, gee, when I went home last night, my husband and I had this conversation, or my wife and I had this conversation, or they'll say, I was wondering about this one part of the Myers-Briggs. So I was answering those questions, and then she put her hand up and she said, we have reservations at 12 o'clock today, and so I need to get a count of who is going. We need to leave at 11:45, so I also need to get a count for who's driving and who's going in what car. Now this was all like super relevant because we were doing all those things. So we answered the question, we got the count, and then I just kind of fed back to her. I said, just as some data for you as you're figuring out your type, the way that you asked that question seemed to be very sensing, and the content was definitely very sensing. And I said, so I'm just giving that to you as data for you to consider. So it means one of two things, and one is that maybe you really do have a preference for sensing. The other is that you have a preference for intuition, and you just happen to be asking a sensing question. So I don't know how helpful that was, but I just wanted to kind of feed back to her, what I was observing. And then on the fourth day of the program, the third day of the program, we did an activity where I broke people up into groups of 4, and their task was to analyze a hypothetical team's type distribution. So they were given a type table that was populated with different types, and they were asked, how would you work with a team like this? And her team members, who were confirmed Ns, were starting to talk about, well, maybe this, and I wonder if they're like this. And they were kind of starting to make some hypotheses and assumptions about the group. And she actually stopped the conversation. She said, we cannot do this. We don't know enough about this team. We don't have enough information. We're making a lot of assumptions that we don't know if any of those things are true. So we cannot do this activity unless we have more information. And what was awesome about that experience is that colleagues fed back to her what they were hearing and just said, wow, that just sounds like a very sensing response to the activity. And so again, it could be that she has a preference for S, could be that she's N who's struggling with the lack of data, but they kind of fed that back to her. On the fourth day, she announced to the group that she actually did have a preference for sensing. And this gets to the question about people who kind of want to be something. What she said she was struggling with all week is her company puts a premium on intuition. The mission of the organization, the language they use, the way they operate is all about going into the unknown, taking a leap into things that you're not sure about, all of those things. And she said she was afraid if she had a preference for sensing that she wouldn't be of value in the organization and she wouldn't be able to move ahead. And what was really great is it was an HR OD team, so they all kind of rallied around her and said, oh my gosh, no, we need people with a preference for sensing. And first of all, not all ideas are good ideas. And second of all, having a preference for S doesn't mean you can't come up with new ideas. You just do it in a way that's different from how someone with a preference for N does it. So it was a really good lesson there, in terms of her examining where she put value on these letters, or where value was being placed. The next example is one that is related to this, but it's a little different in that it's when someone is actually in the right group, so they're in an activity with the right preference, but they don't fit. And this happened actually last month with a physician leadership group I did. And this was my second workshop with them. The first one was an intro workshop, and there was a guy there who wasn't sure if he was ENTJ or ENFJ, and he reported ENFJ. And so I spent about half an hour with him after the first program, talking to him about the difference between T and F. He was in his 50s, which was relevant because we talked about type development and how type development can kind of make it a little more confusing, figuring out your real type. We talked about type and stress, and at the end of the half an hour, he landed on ENFJ, so I think that's really my core. So then last month, came back to the second workshop where I was talking about type and teams, and I had people get in groups based on their 2 middle letters, so their function pairs. And he was with the NF, and he kept saying, I don't relate to you, I don't understand what you're talking about, my experiences are so different. And then he came up to me and talked to me about those same things. We did a TF activity, he was with the F, same conversation, I don't fit, my experience is so different. So toward the end of the workshop during a break, he came up to talk to me about it, and he was, he was really frustrated. And I just said, the thing is, if you had a preference for T, a T would be trying to solve the problem. Like, this is interesting. Like, I thought I was in this group, I'm not in this group. What's the difference? How do I make sense of this? How do I analyze this? And they'd be really trying to kind of solve the problem. I said, if you have a preference for F, you'd really be trying to be understood. And he started laughing, and I said, because if you have a preference for F, it's like you want to be understood for who you are. And he said, I've been doing that. And I said, I know. And so he kind of laughed, and then he said, I think I really am an F. But his type development, I think, for him was really that kind of the confounding variable. So the summary on this is when you're working with people who seem to, not fit, the lessons are, it's perfectly fine to pull someone out of an activity. I do that all the time. Sometimes groups self-regulate and boot someone out of a group and say, why don't you go visit the other? Giving feedback on your observations is perfectly valid. I'm always really careful to say, I'm not saying this is who you are. I'm just feeding what I'm seeing and interpreting it through a type lens. And then the really big thing to remember is anytime we do any activity, showing a picture, having people discuss a topic, we are capturing one slice of that dichotomy. Because, for example, E&I is a very big, complex, multifaceted dichotomy. And anytime you do one activity, you're not capturing the whole thing. So it's not surprising that someone wouldn't always relate to all aspects of that activity. So just in summary on this one, I can show you this picture, and some people will look at it and see a duck, right, with the little bill there and the little eye, and some people will look at it and see a bunny rabbit, right, with the little nose and the little ears here. And so you can do one thing, and it can mean one thing to you, and I can hear it, and it could mean something else to me, and I could be interpreting it completely incorrectly. So the thing I always have to remember is that, I'm an interpreter. I don't hold the answers. I don't know someone better than they know themselves. My job is really to ask the question. And so I always say, so I'm wondering, I hear this, you're saying that, those don't match. And, I believe in type like all of you do. And so when you believe in type, there's a reason why someone does something that can be not matching what their preference is. So we just have to ask the questions. All right, the other question that comes up is about ambiverts. I've heard a lot about ambiverts lately. How does that relate to Myers-Briggs type? And ambiverts, a person whose personality has a balance of extrovert and introvert features. These articles that have come out lately have been about salespeople, showing that people that are high extroverts are not the best salespeople. People that are low extroverts, and in this particular tool, that means having a preference, being an introvert. Those are not the best salespeople, but people are in the middle, kind of a normal curve if you think of that visual. People in the middle are really the best salespeople because they have this balance of extroversion and introversion. And people often use this to refute the Myers-Briggs, and say, well, see, the Myers-Briggs doesn't really work. Do a little pop quiz here. Which is most effective? Typing with your left hand only, typing with your right hand only, or typing with both hands? Yeah, obviously typing with both hands. So the deal is, for example, I'm a right-handed person. There's no question about me being right-handed. I happen to use my left hand when I type because it just helps me get my job done faster. That doesn't make me ambidextrous. It doesn't make me equally right-handed and left-handed. It just supports the Myers-Briggs perspective that you have a preference for one thing, but you often have to use your opposite preference in order to be most effective. Jung actually addressed this in an interview in 1957, and the interviewer asked him, do you perceive the world as one made up of only people who are extreme introverts and people who are extreme extroverts? So you can even hear in the language where the interviewer kind of went to this measuring system of being extreme on either end. And Jung's response was, there's no such thing as a pure extrovert or pure introvert. Such a man would be in a lunatic asylum. People sometimes use that comment as also refuting the Myers-Briggs and say, see, even Jung didn't say that you could be a pure extrovert or introvert. Well, what the theory actually says is, what he said is, if all you do is use your extroversion, that's not an effective way of living, because there's information from your introverted world that you need to access that has value. And if you are a person who has a preference for I and all you do is introvert, you fall into a hole and you lose access to the outer world, and there's important information in the outer world. So he was really clear. His model talks about everyone extroverting a part of themselves and introverting another part, because we need to live in both of those worlds. But that's different than saying you're exactly in the middle. So the ambivert model says, it's better to be both. Jung's model says it's better to have one preference differentiated as your preference, and then using the opposite as needed. Okay, some step 2 questions. How do the subscales/facets work? For example, if someone has all but one facet out of preference for F, that is reported as an F on the step 1. So if you don't use this step 2 a lot, what we're talking about here is, this is a page of the step 2. This person's an INFJ. The blue shows she has a preference for introversion. And we have 5 facets or components of E and I. Initiating, receiving is one, expressive, contained is another, and so forth. She happens to be over on the initiating side here, which is out of preference because she's an I, and that's an E pole of that facet. She has 3 facets that are in preference, and 1 in the mid-zone, which is sharing energy between 2 sides. So to answer that question, I'm going to start with the end response first, and that is the whole is greater than the sum of its parts. So if you look at that picture, there's 9 people on there, there's 1 boat, there's 7 sets of oars, and so on their own, they're one thing, but when they're combined together, they have motion. They create this whole other element together. And so the same thing is true about these facets, is individually they are one thing on their own, but when you combine them together, they all interact together to form this very complex dichotomy. The other interpretation of this is that E and I, as I said earlier, is multifaceted, and the 5 facets that we have identified on the step 2 are not the only 5 facets that comprise the EI dichotomy. They're just 5 elements, but we're not saying they're the only 5 elements. E and I is much richer than just those 5. So that's the end response, because I know it's a little vague. Let me give you the S response. And if the facets were truly subscales, we would have taken the 22 step 1 TF items, and we would have broken them into 5 little subscales. And those add up to 22. And so if you take these and you add them all back up, then they form the TF on the step 1. We did not do that. So that is why when you're using the step 2, try to take the word subscales out of your vocabulary, which is also very hard to do. It's why we got rid of the word subscales when the revision of the step 2 came out many years ago, is because subscales imply that they're additive to the whole, and that is not what we're doing with the step 2. So to continue on that, there are 93 items on the step 1, and there are 144 on the step 2. If the facets were truly subscales, we would have just broken these into facets. But there are items that are on the step 2 that are not on step 1. So for example, TF, questioning accommodating facet. That facet has 5 items. None of those items are on the step 1 T and F. And TF, critical accepting. That has 6 items, and there's only one of those items that is also a TF item on the step 1. So what that means is that someone could report a preference for F on the step 1 with very clear clarity, and yet be out of preference on questioning and critical on the step 2. So when I mentioned earlier the question about can't you interpret the PCI to step 2, sometimes, but not always, because you can't look at a PCI on the step 1 and automatically expect the step 2 will explain it, because that's viewing the step 2 as subscales of the step 1, and they're actually not. The original question was about having 4 facets out of preference on a dichotomy. That's actually really rare. So fewer than 1% of reports have 4 facets truly out of preference. Most times when someone says, oh my gosh, I've got 4 out of preference, if you look at their report, several of those are actually in the mid-zone. They're not truly out of preference. Now, if you do have someone who has that kind of situation, then you just want to do the same thing as a step 1. Ask them, what are the reasons? Why have they made a compromise to their personality? That's what Naomi Quinn calls it. Is when you're out of preference, it's a compromise you've made to your preference. And so what are some of the reasons that may have happened, and how does it work for them? Okay. The other thing is they have 4 facets out of preference. You might want to revisit the step 1 and see, like in the case earlier, the person who's an F but has 4 facets out of preference. You might want to check if that person is F really the right preference for them. Another step 2 question is on the interpreter summary. And the interpreter summary looks like this. It's the last page of the step 2. And how do you describe the last page of the step 2 that shows your score relative to the national sample for that type? Well, actually, whoever wrote the question, you did a really good job, because that is kind of what it is. It's looking at your score, your facet results, relative to the national sample. So this is a little closer image of that page. At the very top, you've got the preference clarity for the person's INFJ. And so we have the PCIs and the PCCs right here. And then this information here is giving us information about how other INFJs report on these facets. These bars are specific to INFJs from our national sample. And from one end to the other is plus or minus 1 standard deviation. So it's about the middle 2/3 of people who are INFJs have a result of 0 to about 4 on the initiating receiving facet, which means most of them are either in the mid-zone or in preference. The little mark there is the average for INFJs. This is the person's result on that facet. And so anytime this number is outside or far outside of the bar, it just tells us that is a way in which that person will likely be very different from other people who have that same preference. So if Joan Sample had a 5 on initiating, that number were way over here, we'd say, wow, if she gets together with other INFJs, she's going to be quite different in that way. All right. Okay, some other questions that came up. Oh, there's one more thing. I knew there was one more thing I wanted to say. Back to that slide. I was just talking to Jean Coomer, one of the authors of the Step 2, a few weeks ago about some Step 2 things, and we were talking about this interpreter summary. And she said it's called the interpreter summary for very intentionally, and they designed it so that it was for you as the interpreter, that it was not something that you gave back to your students or your participants, because it's really meant for you to have a summary of the person's report, so that you don't have to print off, a 17-page, a series of 17-page reports for, a class that you're working with. You can just have a 1-page summary. They feel that this, this is a lot of information, and maybe more information than a student or a client actually needs. Okay, some other questions that came up were what activities or questions can help students differentiate their true preferences. And there are lots and lots. There are so many resources with activities and questions. And so what I'm going to suggest on this one is that you talk to your CPP educational account rep, and they can talk to you about what kind of resources are out there, connecting with other people in the field to find what's out there. But you can talk to Linda or Jack, and they can give you some direction for activities and questions. There was a question about, is there a teen/young adult friendly version of the assessment? And there's a different assessment. It's called the MMTIC. And if you do a Google search for MMTIC, you will find information about it. It's designed for ages 9 to 18. And then there are a couple questions that had to do with some research. So what research has been discovered on MBTI type and identical twins? And has there been any type theory discussions on aspects of type preferences that seem to overshadow whole type? So, does extroversion seem to overshadow, the rest of the 3 letters? And for questions like that, I'm going to suggest that you go to CAPT.org. CAPT it's a Center for Applications of Psychological Type. One of the things that they do is they collect and warehouse research on the MBTI. So when you go to that website, on the left side, you'll see where you can click on research. And then from there, you can click on this thing called Milo, which stands for Mary and Isabel's Library Online. And from there, you can enter a keyword, and then it will list for you all of the research that has been done on your topic, if it has been done. I did look at identical twins. There was one research study that you can take a look at. It's quite dated. I want to say it's from the 1970s, so that's why I didn't include it, because the research is quite old. But if you have questions about research, that's a really good place to go. Okay, those were all of the questions. I just summarized some in categories where they were similar, but those were all the questions that were submitted in advance. So what I'd like to do now is hear from Kim and see if there were any questions that were submitted in real time, and see if I can answer those.
Great. Yes, thank you, Patrick. And if any others still have questions, please submit them now. One of the questions that came in earlier, I'm interested in hearing tips regarding how to introduce type and stress to an intact team and what a recommended activity might be for them to participate in to better understand each other and how they all respond to stress.
Okay. So type and stress, a couple recommendations on that is I would be careful about how quickly you introduce it. So I mentioned these, this physician leadership program, and do a lot of those, and I usually work with them over the course of a year, and I do 3 workshops with them over the course of that year. And type and stress is one of them, but it's the very last one I do. It's kind of their graduation module, because people have to have a really good grasp of their own 4-letter types and really understand the opposites before you can even get into type under stress, because type under stress requires talking about type dynamics, and so they have to be ready for it, and we have to be ready for it as well. Again, for activities and things like that, I'm going to refer you to your account rep at CPP, because there are activities that CPP produces. There are train the trainer programs out there on applications modules for teams, so I'd recommend you take a look at those. Kim?
Oh, yes, sorry about that. I have a question here. In the MBTI career report, how are the job families measured?
I am not sure about that. How are they measured? The information in the career report comes from people who are in those occupations and who report themselves as being satisfied or very satisfied in those occupations. So that's where the data comes from. In terms of how they came up with those categories, again, so I'm going to refer some stuff to your CPP reps, but you can talk to them, and they may have to actually connect you with the researchers. So there's a whole team of researchers that put together the research behind these reports. They're based out of Minnesota, and so if your rep doesn't know, then ask them for a referral to one of the researchers, and they'll definitely be able to answer. So I'm sorry I don't have an answer for that one.
Okay, thank you. Question from Adam. Can you share information about dominant function and auxiliary function, and how does that look when explaining MBTI to clients and or students?
So it's a big topic, but the sort of short version of that is that Jung's focus was on the 2 middle letters, or the two middle dichotomies, so S and N and T and F. And if you think about your type and you think about your 2 middle letters, what Jung said is one of those is your dominant and one of those is your auxiliary function. So one of it is the lead part of your personality. The second is you're there for balance and support to the dominant function. So because your second letter is perception, about taking things in, and your third is about making decisions, those work hand in hand in some order so that you have ways of taking information in and figuring things out. So that's the first thing about your two middle letters. The other is that you extrovert a part of yourself and you introvert another part of yourself. And specifically in your two middle letters, one of those you show to other people, you use primarily externally, and the other you use primarily internally. And there's a whole formula for figuring that out that we go over in the certification program. But how it shows up, this is such an interesting question because I just had it happen in a team building program, or leadership rather, program I did a few weeks ago. And there's someone who have preferences for INTJ. And INTJ's extrovert thinking. So what you hear in them is often, well, here's the logical way to get things done, or that doesn't sound right to me. They're looking to fix problems on the outside, but that's not their dominant function. Their dominant function is actually their intuition, and it's introverted. So on the inside, they're kind of really open. They're exploring new ideas. They're kind of brainstorming with themselves, thinking about new theories. And so I had a side conversation with one of the participants about the dominant and the auxiliary, and she said it explains so much because, and these were exact words, she said, on the outside, she said, people think I'm like this pit bull. She said, but on the inside, she said, I see myself as like a bunny rabbit. I don't know why bunny rabbits are coming up so much today, but those were her words. And so on the inside, she just saw herself as just kind of like curious, looking around, really open to new things. But on the outside, people saw the thinking function. So it can actually, when people are ready to go there, it can be a really important and powerful conversation in terms of, how others may perceive you based on what you extrovert versus what you experience on the inside. Those conversations, I think, are especially powerful for people with a preference for I, because all 8 introverted types introvert their dominant function. And so we know that people constantly mischaracterize introverts because they don't see this favorite, best part of the introvert until the introvert knows them well and lets them see that part of him or herself. So I guess to answer the question, I would talk about it. I think it's a good thing to talk about. I think it's probably like a better second workshop topic than a first, because I think it's a lot to unpack. But it's very powerful if people have the use to go there and the interest to go there.
All right, I actually have a question, and it's one to do with an INTJ as well. I occasionally encounter individuals who don't want to do the questionnaire or participate at all. They invariably, in my experience, turn out to be INTJs. Is there something about that type that is resistant to perceived analysis?
Not that I know of. So I guess I'm thinking a couple things. One is that I was in my introverted part of myself right then. So what I'm thinking is, one thing is that I've used the Myers-Briggs for 24 years, and I've only had one person in 24 years not want to take the Myers-Briggs. Eventually took it, but sort of really, really didn't want to take it, and then didn't participate in the workshop. And that's the only person. And I attribute that to a lot of front-end work on making sure people understand, why we're doing it, who's going to see it, who's not going to see it, that they own the results, they only get to decide if they want to share, all those things that the person asking the question may be doing. But I always attribute it to that because I think people understand that, it really is theirs, and it is this tool for them to understand themselves, and they're not going to be pigeonholed or boxed in. NTs, now with that being said, I will say that NTs are oftentimes the types that will question the Myers-Briggs. I wouldn't put INTJs at the very top of that list, but but they are one of the types that can sometimes be skeptical of type, and it's not that they don't necessarily believe in it, but they often want time to go off and do research and investigate it on their own, see what's out there. But my experience has actually been, because INTJs are dominant introverted intuition, intuition is about exploring and opening up to new ideas and seeing how things are connected, that if you can present it in a way that lets them know that this is something that they can explore and they can figure out how to use in their work, I find INTJs actually kind of get really into the Myers-Briggs. So there might be more there, I guess, is what I'm saying. I haven't had that experience with INTJs. Not to say that your experience isn't valid. I just haven't had the same experience.
We have a question. I'm not sure if you would know the answer, but when having a client take both the MBTI and strong assessments, is there a preferred order of administration? Should they take one assessment first?
Yeah, I used to use, when I did career counseling as part of my business, I used both the strong and the MBTI. I taught a career planning class at a community college for, I think, 11 years, and I used both assessments. And what I just wanted to make sure they did is that they actually just took them separately and not back to back. I think the order isn't really critical, but what you don't want people to do is take them back to back, because they'll get test, I'm going to call quote, test fatigue, responding to so many questions. Now, what I always did was have them complete the MBTI assessment first, because that was always the first thing I talked about when I taught the class. It was the first thing, one of the first things I talked about when I was doing individual work, because it was kind of the framework for, who are you? It helped me figure out how do I need to work with you, and what might be some of your natural inclinations as you look for a career, what might be some of your blind spots. So I always had them do the Myers-Briggs first. We would interpret the Myers-Briggs, and then I would have them do the strong interest inventory after that. Completely assign it to them actually separately and after the Myers-Briggs.
Okay, Patrick, we have time for about one more question. If a person does not care if their results are confidential, then can I share it with others? The question is it ethical or within ethics if they do not care?
We have to, I guess I want to know what do not care means. With Myers-Briggs, we always have to have someone's consent to share their MBTI type. So if they actually tell you, I don't care and you have my consent, that if they've given you consent, then that is your green light to share their type. But you have to make sure that, because I don't care can mean something very different from I give you consent. So, so you want to make sure that those two things are synonymous, and if they are, then that gives you permission to share the person's type.
All right. Well, thank you, Patrick. I have a few things to share with the group here today. I want to make sure everyone knows that they could connect with us, CPP, online. Make sure you follow us to keep up with the latest news, tips, and advice from our team of experts. And then if you are an international customer and would like more information on products and or services, please go to cpp.com/global sales. Many of you may not be receiving our webinar invitations or follow-up emails because you are unsubscribed in our system. So I want to point out, if you haven't done so already, please check your email preferences by visiting cpp.com/email-press, and that will ensure that you actually get all of our emails and follow-ups, and make sure that you're not opted out of the system. This webinar is eligible for one NBCC approved CE clock hour, as well as MBTI Master Practitioner credit. All certificates requested will incur a $7.95 processing fee. In order to qualify to purchase a certificate, you must meet the eligibility requirements noted on the screen. Our system must show that you attended this webinar for the 1 hour. The system will automatically track attendees by email, as well as the live computer screen viewing time. If you're calling in and not viewing the live computer screen, you will not be eligible, as our system cannot track phone calls. So I want to thank everyone. Unfortunately, we've ran out of time, and you all asked so many excellent questions, and thank you, Patrick, for being with us to share your knowledge and expertise. Please visit our website, cpp.com/askanexpert for future Ask an Expert webinars, and you'll also find previously recorded Ask an Expert webinars there. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.